Greetings. My name is David Christensen. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs here at Family Research Council. I'm very excited about today's lecture with Representative Ann Wagner from Missouri's 2nd District. She's going to be talking about a tough issue, but a very, very important issue, the battle for humanity, how conservatives can fight human trafficking. Representative Wagner will be talking about legislation that she has, the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act of 2017, to focus on online sex trafficking issues and concerns via Backpage, other websites, and the need to amend current federal law to allow law enforcement to do their job to help fight this scourge on our country. Let me give you a little background on Representative Wagner. She was at one point a co-chairman of the Republican National Committee during the first term of President Bush. In 2005, Mrs. Wagner was sworn into as the 19th U.S. ambassador to Luxembourg for 4 years. Then she has done a number of things, but let me cut to where she is in Congress. In 2012, she was elected to Missouri's 2nd Congressional District. She is a member of the very important Financial Services Committee, as well as this year becoming a member of the U.S. House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee, where she sits on the Middle East and North Africa Subcommittee and the Asia and Pacific Subcommittee. Throughout her tenure, she has been working on a number of issues, focusing in part on the least of those, or those who are being abused. She's been a defender of life and obviously fighting trafficking. This bill is really a corollary to a bill that she actually had worked on in 2015. The Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, the SAVE Act, as it was called, was actually signed into law. But more needs to be done. And so without further ado, let's hear Representative Ann Wagner talk about this important piece of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for your very kind introduction and for having me here today. Hope all of you aren't here just for the great sandwiches and chocolate chip cookies. Save me one. But I appreciate all that you do, David, and the Family Research Council, to promote life and the family and religious freedom. During my time in Congress, I have been a proud recipient, I will say, of the Family Research Council's actions and the Focus on the Family's True Blue Award. We've worked closely, as you mentioned, on pro-life issues, exposing the harms and healthcare inequality issues behind assisted suicide, and addressing the national public health crisis of pornography. But this year, I'm particularly grateful for the Family Research Council's support of my Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act. This bill would allow the enforcement of criminal and civil trafficking laws against websites like Backpage.com that facilitate online sex trafficking. To date, courts have ruled repeatedly that Backpage has immunity for its actions, despite clear congressional intent to hold these websites accountable. As you may have guessed, my top priority in Congress is to combat online sex trafficking, and I couldn't be successful in this fight if I were alone, and luckily I am not. I'm surrounded by amazing advocates from the conservative and faith communities, anti-trafficking groups, law enforcement, and prosecutors, and victims' rights groups also. When you introduce a bill that both the Family Research Council and National Organization for Women publicly support, you know you have struck new ground, ladies and gentlemen. Don't be afraid. Our coalition has been successful partly because both conservatives and, frankly, liberal feminists understand the nature of America's commercial sex industry. This is an industry that controls women and children through violence, drugs, and trauma. We are talking about young women, girls, and boys living in poverty who have run away from home, who have been placed in the foster care system or who have been kidnapped. We're often talking about women and girls of color. Victims of the commercial sex industry face tremendous violence and abuse. One study found that prostituted women have the highest homicide victimization rate of any set of women ever studied. Another study found that women in the commercial sex industry have mortality rates almost 200 times greater than their peers. Yet another very heartbreaking sample of women and girls in the commercial sex industry tells you, frankly, all you need to know. 9 in 10 had lost their virginity in some act of commercial sex. Who are the men exploiting our daughters? I was shocked to learn that, according to some studies, up to 20% of men admit to having purchased commercial sex at some point in their lives. 20%. But a disproportionate number of sex purchases are made by what I'll call habitual offenders, also called high-frequency buyers or hobbyists, who trade tips and discuss commercial sex online and sustain the market. These buyers tend to be whiter, richer, older, less likely to be married, more educated, and more sexually liberal than the general population. One of the biggest obstacles in the fight against trafficking is low victim identification rates. For most of America's history, and still today, law enforcement may view trafficked women and children in the commercial sex industry as willing participants or even accomplices. Even victims who receive proper treatment by law enforcement still face an uphill battle in assessing and accessing assistance and services. So-called rescued women may be criminalized and face potential detention or deportation. Education of law enforcement is turning the dial on this, but we have a long, long way to go. In many cases, women return to the commercial sex industry because of threats from their traffickers, distrust of law enforcement, or a belief that they have no other options for survival. Pimps actively recruit previously trafficked women from foster homes and shelters, and taken together, these factors help explain why globally it is believed that less than 1% of trafficked victims have been identified. Despite all our rhetoric, sex trafficking in America seems to continue unabated. Meanwhile, Congress is failing to understand the evolving methods of recruitment and sale. With rise of technology, sex trafficking has moved from the streets to the internet. New research shows that underage victims are increasingly likely to first meet their trafficker online, and the majority of underage victims have been advertised and sold online. Online platforms like Backpage.com have created sophisticated marketplaces where traffickers and buyers can post and respond to ads by selling victims. These easy, less risky, anonymous access to victims has arguably created increased demand for hideous sex crimes like the purchasing of a very young girl for sex and the viewing of child pornography. Widespread internet access and wealth in the United States have allowed our country, sadly, to become one of the world's largest producers and consumers of internet child pornography. I mention pornography because porn is also a form of trafficking that has normalized, so to speak, violence and exploitation of women and children. It is widely viewed as a gateway to men entering the commercial sex industry and becoming buyers of sex trafficking victims. The venues of sexual exploitation have changed, but our laws remain stuck in time. And the laws that we do have, such as our sex trafficking statute, aren't enforced. But before I go on, I'd like to stop and remember our government's long history of failing to seriously implement laws that combat sex trafficking. In an 85-page article that Rachel Wagley, who's in the back of the room, my senior policy advisor on this issue, and I published in the Harvard Journal on legislation earlier this year, don't worry, I'm not going to read all 85 pages here for you, I argue that Congress has consistently failed to ensure proper implementation of sex trafficking laws in America's court system. It has allowed the courts to overrun congressional intent time and time again. This is exactly what is happening with Backpage.com in our courts today, and what my Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act seeks to clarify. My parents taught me that we have a responsibility to know and learn from history. And let me tell you, Congress has a long history of allowing the courts to deny legislative progress in the fight against trafficking. And I'm going to give you a couple examples here. Sex trafficking is a form of slavery. A form of slavery as old as the nation itself, but it has not always been a crime. Prior to emancipation, sexual slavery was effectively legal. The victims most obviously were exploited in the country's early years were African women and girls. The purchase of enslaved women for rape and prostitution and forced breeding with other slaves was common practice, particularly in the American South. So-called fancy girl auctions were ostentatious manifestations of this horrific practice. At these auctions, girls were paraded and even stripped before potential buyers. They were not recognized as victims. When their existence was recognized by society at all, they were outrageously characterized as voluntary prostitutes, allegedly luring men away from chastity. At the same time, abolitionists began raising awareness of the true nature of sex slavery. And during a public lecture in 1850, one of my heroes, Frederick Douglass, candidly condemned the sanctioned and systematic sexual slavery inherent in the American slave trade, saying, and I quote, "I hold myself ready to prove that more than 1 million of women in the southern states of this union are, by the laws of the land and through no fault of their own, consigned to a life of revolting prostitution, that by those laws in many of the states, if a woman in defense of her own innocence shall lift her hand against the brutal aggressor, she may be lawfully put to death." Congress, this is 1850. Congress finally abolished slavery by means of the 13th Amendment, as you well know, in 1865. Section 1 of the amendment abolished slavery and involuntary servitude. Section 2 of the amendment held that, and I quote, "Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." Congress knew from the beginning that passage of the 13th Amendment was just the first step in fully enforcing the end of slavery. The Republicans moved swiftly to pass laws that would guarantee all men the civil rights inherent to a free society. During the original ratification debates of the 13th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, Republicans in Congress argued that the sustainment of freedom required more than just mere emancipation. Slavery must be defeated not only in form, but in substance. Congress also clearly intended the amendment to apply not only to the African slave trade, but to all forms of slavery. Republicans believed that the Constitution should provide full rights for former slaves, but also free blacks, white laborers, and any other kind of slave. But federal courts were uncooperative. The Supreme Court's rulings in the famous slaughterhouse cases in 1872 and civil rights cases in 1883 gutted the authority and the scope of the Reconstruction Amendments and undermined congressional authority to abolish slavery and promulgate affirmative rights. These rulings defied clear congressional intent and power, and they had lasting ramifications on the fight against sex trafficking. Because of these rulings, the 13th Amendment has provided neither historical or modern victims with a remedy for enslavement and involuntary servitude. Problematically, Congress did not fight back against these rulings. In fact, legislators ceded to them. Even though these racist and unjust rulings were eventually eroded, Congress kind of tiptoed around them by enacting future sex trafficking and civil rights legislation pursuant to the Commerce Clause instead of the Reconstruction Amendments. Even though Congress explicitly passed the Reconstruction Amendments to affirm the natural rights of all people, I'm going to jump forward here now to my next example. In 1910, Congress passed the Mann Act. The Mann Act criminalized sex trafficking of women across state lines. The Senate Immigration Committee Majority Report clarified that Congress aimed only to address situations where women and girls were compelled, quote, against their will and desire to enter and continue in a life of prostitution. So though Congress was crystal clear that the law was only intended to apply to commercial sex acts, the Supreme Court ruled that the Mann Act could be applied to non-commercial sex acts. Camenetti versus United States in 1917 held that the law could be used against married men who brought their mistresses across state lines. The Mann Act was then notoriously used vindictively and politically in multiple jurisdictions. In addition, while Congress clearly passed the Mann Act to protect women in the United States versus Holt, the Supreme Court ruled that women who were alleged, quote, willing participants in the sex trade could be guilty of conspiracy under the Mann Act. The court's dissenting opinion argued that lawmakers were clear that transported women should only be treated as victims, and that the majority's decision would make the Mann Act, quote, a sword with which to punish those whom the Mann Act was intended to protect. In the wake of the Holt decision, the Attorney General asked Congress to clarify the Mann Act to protect women. Legislation, and pay attention to this, legislation was introduced to this effect, but Congress never voted on it. I tell you these two stories because they are parallel to the struggle that we face today. The U.S. justice system is ignoring congressional intent once again and awarding wins to Backpage.com. But not enough members of Congress understand our legislative and moral duty to right this ship. A Senate investigation concluded in January this year that Backpage knowingly facilitates child sex trafficking, coaches posters on how to post, quote, clean sex trafficking ads, and edits ads that sell children. The Washington Post reported just last week in an amazing expose that Backpage employed a contractor in the Philippines to aggressively solicit and draft suspected child sex trafficking ads. Despite the fact that Backpage.com controls up to 80% of America's online commercial sex industry, the Department of Justice has invested no energy into investigating it. Backpage's victims and state attorneys general have had to take justice into their own hands to stop rampant online trafficking. Since 2010, several brave victims have sued Backpage.com, exercising their rights to seek justice against the entity that in fact facilitated their slavery. Some of these cases are depicted in the I Am Jane Doe. It is a documentary that I implore you all to see here while you're in town. You can get it on Netflix. You've got to see I Am Jane Doe. But courts have repeatedly ruled in favor of Backpage.com because of a little-known law called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act of 1996, the CDA. Section 230 includes broad criminal and civil immunity provisions to protect websites that host third-party content. And while Backpage.com is not a neutral host, courts have misinterpreted the CDA to shield it from liability for the sex trafficking advertisements that it facilitates. Federal law and some state laws give sex trafficking victims the right to bring a suit against their trafficker, including the websites that participate in trafficking. But courts have construed Section 230 to mean that sex trafficking victims who have been sold on Backpage.com have no recourse against the websites that facilitated their sales. Section 230 also blocks states from bringing criminal cases against websites that facilitate trafficking. Section 230 explicitly allows state prosecutors to enforce intellectual property laws, but not any other laws. This has handcuffed efforts to stop trafficking at the state level, and in 2013, 49 state attorneys general called on Congress to unite their hands and allow them to bring justice on online traffickers, bring them to that justice. 49 attorneys general. Congress obviously never intended Section 230, passed over 20 years ago, to create a lawless internet where people can commit sex crimes online that they cannot commit offline. It clearly did not intend to strip states of their ability to enforce sex trafficking laws, and it clearly did not intend to strip trafficking victims of their rights to access justice. It clearly did not believe that rape is a prerequisite of the free and open internet. In fact, the opposite was true. Section 230 of the CDA was an attempt by Congress to protect children from internet obscenity. Nebraska Senator Exxon, so this is going back to 1996 during the debate on the CDA. So 20 years ago, then Nebraska Senator Exxon, a Democrat, who introduced the bill, said at the time that, quote, the information superhighway should not become a red light district. This legislation will keep that from happening and extend the standards of decency which have protected telephone users to new telecommunications devices. Once passed, our children and families will be better protected from those who would electronically cruise the digital world to engage children in inappropriate communications and introductions. I close quote. Yes, Rachel spent countless hours perusing the Federal Register to find what was true congressional intent as laid out by Senator Exxon. But the CDA, in practice, has allowed the internet to become a red light district. The anti-indecency provisions of the CDA were struck down a year after passage in Reno versus the ACLU. Only Section 230 remained. Judges should review congressional intent behind CDA when navigating sex trafficking cases. But unfortunately, they have not. Backpage.com and tech lobbyists have pushed for a legal interpretation that immunizes websites like Backpage from the sex trafficking ads that they facilitate. Meanwhile, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has witnessed a shocking 846% increase in suspected child sex trafficking reports in recent years. These victims include many women and girls that I have personally met. Over the past 5 years, I have had the remarkable opportunity to visit safe houses in my own state of Missouri and across the country that provide shelter to young girls who have been sold on Backpage.com. It is literally heartbreaking that while these survivors piece their lives back together, the websites that financially benefit from facilitating their slavery are let off scot-free. I find it hard to imagine that if a business hosted a slave auction, that the auctioneer could not be held criminally liable. Again, if you can't commit it offline, you shouldn't be allowed to commit the crime online. But that's exactly what is happening with Backpage.com. Last year, ruling in favor of Backpage.com in Jane Doe 1 versus Backpage.com, the First Circuit described an inherent conflict between Section 230 and the nation's sex trafficking laws. The federal criminal code gives victims the right to access justice against their traffickers, but Section 230 shields Backpage.com from liability for participating in sex trafficking. The court concluded that, quote, the remedy to the tension between these laws is through legislation, not litigation. This is directly from the First Circuit. Congress holds a simple solution in its hands. Congress can amend Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to clarify that sex trafficking is not protected in Section 230's immunity provisions. State attorneys general should be able to enforce their sex trafficking laws. Victims should be allowed to bring cases against websites that participate in trafficking, and the federal government should be able to pursue criminal charges against websites that recklessly facilitate the crime. This is exactly what my legislation, the Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, will do. It will amend Section 230 and create liability for online sex trafficking. It is the single most effective action that Congress can take to end sex trafficking in this country. But there is pushback from the tech community, which doesn't want to see any changes to Section 230 whatsoever, despite the court saying to Congress, legislate. My bill is a narrow, surgical fix to the tension between Section 230 and sex trafficking law. But big tech and others are clinging to a slippery slope fallacy. According to one estimate, Google makes up to $1 billion a year in illegal ad revenue. $1 billion a year. So you understand the fight. In fact, in 2011, Google settled with the Department of Justice's investigation into Google's facilitation of illegal drug sales for $500 million. Tech companies seem worried that if Congress amends Section 230 now to create liability for sex trafficking crimes, Congress may amend it again in the future to allow state AGs to bring cases for other unlawful activities that websites are involved in. But the simple fact is, unlawful is unlawful. Meanwhile, the most vulnerable members of our society are trafficked online They are raped repeatedly and left without access to justice. For my 37 colleagues so far who have co-sponsored the legislation, and over 50 law enforcement and prosecutors organizations, shelters, and faith-based anti-trafficking and women's rights groups that have rallied behind this amending of CDA, we believe it is a moral and legal imperative. One supporting organization told me that 100% of the young women in their safe house were trafficked on Backpage.com. If we do not allow our nation's law enforcement officials to enforce our nation's laws, and if we give victims the right to justice, but deprive them of their right to use their right to justice, who are we? Who are we as a nation? How serious are we about preventing the rape and exploitation of our most vulnerable? The question now is whether Congress will act to protect the women and girls who are sold into slavery online, or let the bill fall into oblivion to protect Backpage.com. I remain optimistic, but I'm also painfully aware that Congress has unaccountably chosen to defer to mistaken courts many times before. Lastly, I just want to ask for your help and your advocacy today. I hope that's why you're here in this room, why many of you that are watching as we stream this online, Facebook and beyond, as you use this as an educational and a little bit of a history lesson of how we got here. I'm asking for your help. We need your help in spreading the message and recruiting co-sponsors for this bill. Remember, we're at 37 so far. We must lift that number up. This is a serious battle that no one of us can fight alone. So I thank you for your time, for your interest, for what you're going to do to take care of the most vulnerable in our society and to make sure that we can stand proudly as a nation in protecting our daughters, our sisters, our sons. I thank you.